If you would you like to perhaps gather in a little bit, keep warmer. That's marvellous.
Well, it's not working terribly well, is it?
Okay. Right, welcome everybody, and I'm sorry it's such foul weather. This is typical Malcolm Lowry, isn't it? This is his birthday, and he's bestowed us with all this. Anyway, I'm Brian Biggs, I'm the Artistic Director of Blue Coat. So, welcome, Mr Mayor and Mayoress of Wirral. We're very pleased that you've come here today. And also, very special welcome to members of the Lowry family, who I can see just coming at the back. So, welcome, members of the Lowry family, welcome, fans of Malcolm Lowry, welcome, Wirral residents. So, we're here today to... hello. Come on in. Come on in. Hello, Jill. Nice to meet you. Right, I'm just going to start. You're not saying your speech till a bit later.
Oh.
So don't worry. You'll be in the comfort of another room inside. Okay. So you can stay here, or you can join your family over there if you wish.
I don't mind.
Okay. Right. She might need an umbrella.
Jill.
Okay. So I'm just saying say a few words before I hand over, so I know we need to move on. So Malcolm Lowry, as you probably all know, was born here in New Brighton on this very day in 1909, and it's appropriate that this plaque is being unveiled on his birthday, positioned on the seawall, looking out to the Mersey and the Mersey estuary, appropriate for a writer whose voyages took him across the oceans. Now, Lowry, as you know, is best known as the author of the classic modernist novel Under the Volcano, and is widely regarded as one of the country's most innovative writers, perhaps more celebrated internationally than in the UK. Shortly after he was born here in New Brighton, the family moved to Cllr, where he spent his childhood. And though he left Merseyside at an early age, the topography of the Wirral, with its beaches, its woods, its golf courses and its lighthouses, set against the backdrop of North Wales, is vividly recalled in his writing. So Lowry studied literature at Cambridge before leaving England for an eventful life in Europe, America, Mexico and Canada, where he settled, living in a squatter's shack at a place called Dollerton on the Burrard Inlet just north of Vancouver with his second wife Marjorie Bonner. So here, during the Second World War, he completed his great novel Under the Volcano, which is set in Mexico as the world headed towards war. Structured around a single day, the Day of the Dead in 1938, in the life of an alcoholic British ex-consul. The book is a richly layered meditation on the human condition and a portrayal of self-destruction. If you haven't read it, have a go. It's hard going, but as you know, all of us that are involved in this thing today, we love that book so much, and you should all read it if you haven't yet. So, published in 1947, and it's still in print by Penguin, the book was hailed as a modern masterpiece, and it continues to be listed among the most significant novels of the 20th century. In 1984, it was adapted by John Huston for a film starring the late Albert Finney as the consul. After spending most of his adult life abroad, Lowry died in Sussex in 1957. In his life, he had only one other book published called Ultramarine 1933, which is based on his voyage as a young deckhand sailing from Birkenhead docks to the Far East in 1927. And he left several unfinished books, short stories and poems, many of them unpublished posthumously. Now, since 2009, a group of Lowry enthusiasts called the Firminists, who are named after the main character in Under the Volcano, Geoffrey Firmin, have been working with Blue Coat to research and celebrate the writer and reconnect him to Merseyside, through an annual Lowry Lounge programme. And we were delighted when Conservation Areas Wirral invited Blue Coat to be involved in arranging for this plaque to be installed, and we'd very much like to thank the Conservation Areas Wirral, and particularly Peter Bolt, who's here today, and he's provided the curtain. Two lovely assistants holding up. This commemoration comes during Wirral's year as Liverpool City Region Borough of Culture, and I'd very much like to congratulate the council for honouring Malcolm in this way. And though Lowry never returned to Merseyside, his lost novel, In Ballast to the White Sea, is set largely in Wirral and in Liverpool, and after it was rescued by a group of international scholars, it was published in 2014. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen Tukey,
I'm behind you.
who's behind me, who is one of the feminists, one of these enthusiasts for Lowry, and a poet based in Liverpool, and she's going to say a few words and read a short passage from his writing that demonstrates his importance, the importance of Wirral to Lowry's writing. So, ladies and gentlemen, Helen Tukey.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Yeah, so as Brian said, one of the many reasons to celebrate Malcolm Lowry as a Merseyside writer is that although he left Britain in his early 20s and he never returned until the last years of his life, the settings and the landscapes of Liverpool and the Wirral run through all of his writing in vividly recalled detail. His descriptions of Liverpool in particular were not always entirely positive. He famously referred to it as that terrible city whose main street is the ocean. And in his short story Present Estate of Pompeii, the narrator remarks that Pompeii reminds him of the ruins of Liverpool on a Sunday afternoon. But the landscape of the Wirral often appears in his writing as a kind of idyllic setting, contrasting with the terrible city, and it seems to remain always in his mind as a kind of template, the landscape that he remembers and compares other landscapes to, even in what might seem unlikely circumstances. Here's a short description from his novel Dark as the Grave Wherein My Friend Is Laid, of flying in a plane over Mexico when he and his second wife Marjorie returned there in 1945. A landscape like innumerable striped sphinxes lying on their backs, a landscape of frozen waves, a land of inconceivable desolation, and in the midst of this was a single farm by a waterhole with fields smoother than golf greens in Hoylake, England. It's worth noting that Lowry, like his father, who was the captain of Colby Golf Club, was a keen golfer, and Brian and I have been enjoying the fact that a golfer named Lowry, although no relation as far as we know, has just won this year's Open. So to show how closely Lowry remembered the Wirral landscape and how much it meant to him, I'm just going to read a short passage from his masterpiece, the 1947 novel Under the Volcano. The novel is set in Cuernavaca in Mexico, but here in the first chapter one of the characters is remembering a time when he stayed with the young Geoffrey Firmin when they were both teenagers with a family named the Taskersons on the Wirral. And here I want you to imagine that we're just a bit further round the coast that way, looking out from Hoylake and West Kirby over the Dee estuary, and that it's not raining. And I hope this will give you a sense not only of how important Merseyside was and remains to Malcolm Lowry, but also simply what a wonderful writer he is. The Taskersons lived in a comfortable house whose back garden abutted on a beautiful undulating golf course, bounded on the far side by the sea. It looked like the sea. Actually, it was the estuary, 7 miles wide, of a river. White horses westward marked where the real sea began. The Welsh mountains, gaunt and black and cloudy, with occasionally a snow peak to remind Jeff of India, lay across the river. During the week, when they were allowed to play, the course was deserted. Yellow, ragged sea poppies fluttered in the spiny seagrass. On the shore were the remains of an antediluvian forest with ugly black stumps showing, and further up an old, stubby, deserted lighthouse. There was an island in the estuary, with a windmill on it like a curious black flower, which you could ride out to at low tide on a donkey. The smoke of freighters, outward bound from Liverpool, hung low on the horizon. There was a feeling of space and emptiness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just remember that last line, because it will make some sense in a minute. I'm now going to hand over to the Mayor of Wirral, Councillor Tony Smith, to say a few words about this occasion in the context of Wirral Borough Culture. So, Councillor Smith.
Thank you very much, Brian. As you have heard, Malcolm Lowry truly deserves the accolade of this blue plaque in his hometown of New Brighton, and on behalf of Wirral Council I am honoured to unveil this memorial to such an important writer. Lowry was born not far from here at number 13 North Drive. We owe it to another New Brighton resident, Colin Dilnot, for verifying this location through years of meticulous research. He also discovered the location of Lowry's first school, Braeside in West Kirby, which the writer attended while growing up in Caldy. The young Malcolm explored Wirral on bike or on foot, And as Brian has said, this landscape was evoked in his writing. Although he left our borough behind with its beautiful countryside and coastline, its working docks and transport links to Liverpool, the cinemas, pubs and dance halls that he frequented as a young man in the 20s, all are brought to life in his writing. Wirral has a rich history of writers, and there has been commemorative plaques in honour of some of them. The war poet Wilfred Owen in Birkenhead, and more recently the pioneering science fiction writer Olaf Stapleton, whose plaque is on a railway bridge arch on the Wirral Way, close to his West Caribbean home. We can now add Malcolm Lowry to this distinguished company. The Lowry family remained on the Wirral, and we are delighted to be joined by some of them today, as well as other relatives from further afield. They provide a link from the Wirral of the early years of the 20th century that Malcolm knew so well to the present. This plaque on the sea wall, directing our gaze to the oceans that he travelled, will remain as a testament to his origins here, the place that inspired much of his writing. Our celebration of Malcolm Lowry is part of this year's Wirral Borough Culture programme. The team who are delivering our special year, along with my fellow councillors, realise that it is important to recognise the past greats of the area who have contributed to our rich tapestry that span our cultural icons, including Malcolm Lowry, as well as recognising our industrial past and maritime history. We are very pleased to be working closely with history and heritage groups across Wirral in recognising the many lives connected to the peninsula. I'm looking forward to the Heritage Open Days in September and plan to explore some of the hidden gems of Wirral. We will have a second opportunity to look more closely at Lowry's life as the evenings turn darker, and we will look forward to hearing what Brian and the team have planned in due course. I am delighted now to unveil the plaque and hope that our invited guests will join us for refreshments in the sailing school. Thank you.
Bob, you're going to do the slides there. Up the top. Just a bit.
Somebody just fell out.
Yes? Thank you. Turn up a bit. Thank you. If you can actually all come in a bit more to save you standing around the doorway, there's plenty of room over here as well. So do move inside. Okay, right. Welcome everybody. I'm not going to say what I've just said outside because you've heard it all before. But there is a lot more I do want to say, but we try and keep these speeches brief. So welcome everybody. As I said, I'm Brian Biggs, the Artistic Director of Bluecoat, and Mr Mayor and Mayoress, who are still here, I think, or at least Mr Mayor is here. Welcome, and a special welcome to the family of Malcolm Lowry, some of whom are going to say a few words a bit later on. So really on behalf of the Firminists, these sort of Lowry fans that have been doing things for the last 10 years, we'd really like to thank again Conservation Areas Wirral for coming up with the idea to have a blue plaque for Malcolm Lowry here in New Brighton. We'd like to thank Wirral Council for their foresight in actually doing this and actually doing these other blue plaques. Olaf Stapleton, another great writer from Merseyside, from Wirral, he's honoured by a plaque only a couple of months ago, so that's fantastic. Do people know that song by It's Immaterial called New Brighton in the Rain? We should have been playing that, shouldn't we? It's a very melancholic song, and actually this is a very joyous occasion, so perhaps it wouldn't be the right choice. So the format is, I'm going to say a few words, I'm going to hand over to other people to say a few words, and then we're going to have a toast to Malcolm because it's his birthday. So if you haven't got a drink, you might just want to ask if somebody can pass through some drinks. Okay, now Malcolm, as we know, is a truly worldwide phenomenon, and his book, particularly Under the Volcano, is read from New Zealand to America, from France to Canada, from Mexico to the UK. And it's from these places that Lowry scholars and enthusiasts have sent us a few messages for today. In Malk's days it would have been telegrams, of course, but now with email we can get these things really quickly. And I'm just going to read out a couple with Helen. So the first one comes from Cheryl Grace, who is really one of the foremost Lowry scholars at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And she says, "I wish I could be there, but since I cannot, I send my warmest greetings to the Lowry family and to my dear Liverpool colleagues on this wonderful occasion. Malk is somewhere watching and chuckling. Sursum corda," which means lift up your hearts.
That's nice. And this one is from Mark Goodall, from the University of Bradford, who was the founder of the Feminists, and he edits a journal of the same name. And he says, "Read this in the form of a telegram. Dear Malcolm, stop. Hope the voyage that never ends is going well. Stop. Reminder that the deadline passed 70 years ago. End."
Okay, the next one is from Paul Thiessen, from Wilfrid Laurier University in Ontario in Canada. Before Cuernavaca and, I can never say this, Cllr. It's Tlaxcala. It's like Oaxaca, it's one of those. Before Vancouver and Dollarton, there was Liverpool and the Wirral. Congratulations on bringing Lowry to his home in the north. Looking towards Liverpool, he experienced the sensation of seeing straight north, a vast white calm where sea was confused with sky. And that's a quote from the book In Ballast to the White Sea. Congratulations and best wishes.
The next one's from Alberto Ribollo of the Malcolm Lowry Foundation, and he organises a Malcolm Lowry colloquium in Cuernavaca in Mexico. He says, "They say nobody is a prophet in their own land, and it's a shame that this is the case of our beloved Malcolm Lowry, who is considered by us, his apostles in Mexico, as a real prophet. We recently unveiled a kind of blue plaque of our own outside one of the oldest cantinas in Cuernavaca, La Estrella, the Star, that reads, 'What beauty can compare to that of a cantina in the early morning?' We'd like to see a museum, but for now we are planning a statue for him in Cuernavaca. We send greetings and hope to see you in Liverpool on the next Day of the Dead to continue celebrating his life and work."
Okay, Patrick McCarthy from the University of Miami in Florida. "It seems an especially appropriate omen, one that Malcolm Lowry would have relished, that this ceremony honouring his work follows so soon after another Lowry won the 2019 British Open Golf Tournament, which we heard about before. Cheers to all in honour of our Dun of the Fairways and his creator."
Miguel Mota from the University of British Columbia, who's another amazing scholar of Lowry's work. This is very gnomic. It says, "Also mentions sporting coincidences and sends his best wishes."
Okay. Catherine de la Salle Nancy from the University of Jean Moulin in Lyon. "This is a great birthday present to Malcolm Lowry, and I'm sure from where he is, he'll be delighting in this tribute, hoping his father can see it, and celebrating, of course, in style. I wish I could be there with you. Cheers." And there's one more.
So finally, Chris Ackley from the University of Otago in New Zealand says, "While I cannot be there to help launch the Blue Liner, I shall, like John Masefield, go down to the sea again, and, unlike Matthew Arnold, think of it not as salt estranging, but as linking friends of Lowry all over the world."
Okay, so quite a poetic one there from Chris Ackley. So without more ado, I'd really like to hand over to Jill Colvin. And Jill is Malcolm's niece, and as far as we know, the only living family member who actually met him. And she's going to have a personal recollection of the family and Malcolm, and I'm very delighted to hand over to Jill.
awful lot of the things that I spent a couple of days trying to write a speech have already been mentioned. So I'm going to take a slightly different line on it. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming and standing up in the absolutely pouring, driving rain. To thank all the people who took my umbrella which blew out, my handbag, and all the rest of the things, all the clobber away from it, so that I could stand up under the umbrella. Thank you very much. I'm going to start by mentioning my grandfather, Malcolm's dad, who was a cotton broker and who built a lovely house in Cllr, which I remember going to so well. Uncle Stuart was a cavalry officer in the First World War, aged about 19. Next came Wilfred, my father, who was a rugby international, and at the time really very well known round this area because one of the Liverpool Echo and Daily Post writers used to write on him every week, so he had quite a big following. Then there was Russell, who had two sons who both got double first at Oxford. And then came Uncle Malcolm, who was a bit of an afterthought years afterwards. Now, dear Malcolm was an absolutely sweet boy. Daddy taught him to play golf, and they all went to school at the Lees at Cambridge, and Daddy used to look after them all and take them up, because my grandmother didn't have very good health. But Grandad was fine. He used to swim the River Mersey, starting at Seacombe. And all my life, I've been looking for the place where he could possibly have landed when he got across to Liverpool. Because there don't seem to be very many good places where he could land, really. Certainly not now. And you know, even in those days, what was the pollution like? And what if huge liners were coming from America? You know, sort of thing. Anyway, with my... The house there was lovely at Cllr, and I remember in the lounge they had gorgeous furry throws over the furniture, and I always longed to be able to go and lie on those, but I always used to be sent to the kitchen to speak to the staff and the parrot that was called Lala, and so I got to know Lala extremely well. And I think that today is a very memorable day for Uncle Malcolm. I think his book is marvellous. I'm just reading it at the moment. I think that the first chapter should all be skipped by everybody, really. But he certainly did make his name, and I think it's terribly sad that his life was cut short by alcoholism. And this meant that because it's upset my dad so much, that I grew up in a household where we hardly had any drink at all, because it horrified him so much, because he died so young, and heaven knows what else he could have done. But it's lovely to see you all here today, and welcome, and thank you all for coming in this terrible weather.
Thank you.
I'll do that.
Oh.
He's not doing it yet.
Oh, he's
somebody
not.
else.
Well, I shall escape now.
That was lovely. Thank you so much, Jill. I'd like to really now hand over to Colin Dilnot, whose importance to the study of Lowry's writing and influence, and particularly his relationship to this place, to New Brighton and the Wirral generally, is huge. Like Helen, he's done much to position Malcolm as a Merseyside writer and a writer very much for today. So Colin, over to you.
Right, so. Thanks a lot. I just want to say look forward into the future to the next walk and the next Lowry Lounge, which I'll be helping with, which is in November the 2nd, isn't it, Brian? And I hope some of you can return to that. And I'll just give you a sort of brief idea about Malcolm and New Brighton. Yes, he was born here, and yes, he moved away about just before his second birthday, but it never left him. And when you look at his first novel, Ultramarine, as a young man, he sailed down that river there, past the ford, past the lighthouse, and out into the Far East. But in the novel which he put together after he came back, Ultramarine, his first published novel, New Brighton pervades that novel. The reason why, it's based around a love story which he remembers and thinks about while he's out in the Far East and feels very guilty about a real woman, actually. Her name was Tess Evans, and she lived in Liskeard. So that sort of first novel is very much infused with his ideas and his feelings about New Brighton, and it's mentioned quite a few times. Later on in the 1930s, when he was in self-imposed exile in America, he started writing a book which was eventually published after he died several years ago, called Ballads to the White Sea. Now, one of those chapters in there, chapter 13, of a very important political novel, perhaps I think the most important political novel of the whole of the 1930s, and probably will be rightly seen as that in the future. One of the most interesting chapters, chapter 13, actually takes place right along the coast of North Wales and the Wirral, out around Merseyside. But one of the most important things happens actually just a couple of hundred yards away from us. The plane which he's in, which he flies in, which must have been based on real life. His friend Tom Foreman was a pilot and who he met at Cambridge, and he must have made this flight from speak properly. He looks down on that force, and though he didn't call it the industrial military complex, he was very anti sort of capitalism, and he has this imaginary thought of actually flying against the symbol of empire and might and power and destroying it in his imagination. So I'll talk more about that when on the war. And finally, late in his life, when he was still in Canada, he started on writing probably what would become a novella called Ghost Keeper. Now, this novella is very much about sort of rebirth and about the creative imagination. And as a writer, he's looking back on his time of sort of writing. And what happens is he goes out one day and he walks around parts of Vancouver, which reminds him of New Brighton, and he starts thinking about rebirth. But then a strange coincidence happens, because he goes to the cinema, and what film does he see? He sees The Magnet. Now, anyone who knows The Magnet, this wonderful film which was made in 1950, is actually centred in New Brighton. When he sees this film, that provokes all sorts of thoughts and ideas about sort of creativity, but more importantly, he sees all of New Brighton very much as he left it in the 1930s. So, though he was born here, New Brighton actually sort of pervaded quite a number of his writings and was at the back of his thoughts. And I think what is very interesting and fun is that if he'd finished that novella, what might have come of it, and we always have to say that with Malk, what might have been, but I think what might have come out of it was the sort of whole idea of sort of rebirth. Now, whether that rebirth would have taken place in Vancouver, in Dolan, in the shack, or whether that might have been that he might have eventually come back to his home, but in his imagination he travels back through the film back to his home. So hopefully when later on in this year I'll be looking at that in a lot more detail. So it's been a long journey, 10 years to get to this actual point, but I'm pleased to be part of it, and I'm pleased, like everyone else here today, to see so many people celebrating his birthday, and also the blue plaque as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Colin. And it is a great pleasure now to introduce Jeremy Lowery, who's Malcolm's great-nephew. He didn't have the good fortune to meet him, but he's totally immersed himself in his writing over the last few years, coming along to our events in Liverpool. I'm very delighted to introduce Jeremy Lowery.
Mr. Mayor, feminists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Brian, for those kind words of introduction. It's somewhat with trepidation that I stand up before you just now, but it's also with a great deal of privilege and an honour. As Brian just said, I'm a member of the family who never met him, but it's an opportunity for me to share my thoughts about Uncle Malcolm. I don't have any new material to share at all with you today, but I've got a couple of observations, and I'd like to pose a question. As you know from what Jill has said, Malcolm was the youngest of 4 brothers. Those brothers all travelled widely, not just for the family business, but also on their own account. A reflection perhaps of Liverpool's position at the start of the last century as the then second city of what was the British Empire. A strongly international outlook towards the rest of the world was part and parcel of the family DNA then, and it's something I'm pleased to say has not diminished since. Before departing from Birkenhead, back there, on the Pyrrhus, Malcolm will have heard, I'm quite sure, tales of music, writing, sporting endeavour, from first-hand experiences from Texas, New York, Monte Carlo, Paris, Edinburgh, just to name a few places, from members of his immediate family. The big difference is that only Malcolm returned briefly before leaving for good, as you know, first to go to Mexico and then to Canada. And when he returned to the UK just before he died, he didn't come back here. Whereas his three brothers that Jill has spoken about all lived out their time on the Wirral. Malcolm may have been regarded locally by some as unknown at best and probably black sheep at worst. But for me, when his brother, and I think probably his staunchest ally, Russell, spoke about him, a sort of slightly far away look for me came to his eye. Happy memories of the one that truly got away and made an enduring name for himself. The one about which far more has been written than he ever wrote himself. For me, that reputation that he had has all changed. We've heard earlier about the Lowry lounges. I'd like to add, and as well as Colin's walks, I'd like to add the session in Lingham's bookshop in 2009 that Ian called who I haven't seen Ian, but I don't know whether is Ian here today. Ian was arranged that, and Gordon Bowker, who wrote, I think, one of the best biographies
of anybody.
Yeah, came and spoke there. And more recently, Brian and Ian Macmillan spoke on Great Lies very enthusiastically about Malcolm, despite, for me at least, I'm sure many others of you will have heard that short radio piece. Ian spoke incredibly enthusiastically about Malcolm. However, that steadily increasing awareness for me totally changes today. I think it's an important milestone in the journey that genuinely doesn't ever end, for me at least, as well as the rest of you. And again, to quote, if you don't mind, your words, the curious internationalist, I think Malcolm is clearly in his writings and standing here and looking out, he clearly never forgot his roots. So in terms of the question, what I'd like to ask, and it'll be interesting talking to you after the formalities here end, is what would he have made of a plaque being raised in his honour? As a master storyteller, where the facts are so often shrouded in literary subtext and ever so subtly changed to create the imagery that Malcolm sought, would he have made much of him having the same recognition of Lord Byron, who I only recently learnt was the first Briton ever to have a blue plaque created for him? What would he have made of his near contemporary Wilfred Owen, who we've heard about already today, whose plaque sits behind us up in Tranmere to commemorate his short residency on the Wirral whilst he attended school? Similarly, I wonder what his attitude towards Sir Henry Tate would have been, whose plaque in nearby Hamilton Terrace, which actually has memories not just for the Lowry family but the other branch of the family as well, tells us that this is Sir Henry Tate's, that he traded sugar from that office in Hamilton Square before founding the Tate Gallery. I think of those, his attitude towards Sir Henry Tate may have been somewhat ambivalent. Finally, the Fab Four did not, at least to my knowledge, ever record anything with the ukulele. But I think it's fitting that their plaque near the tower over there is closest to his own. Overall, then, and in conclusion, I think he would have been delighted, and that he probably, no, certainly, would have celebrated with whatever was at hand. Recognition at home is perhaps the hardest thing to achieve when you go off and do the opposite of what is expected of you. He wanted to be a writer, he was a writer, and now he will be remembered as a writer. For anyone who wanders along what I believe is the longest promenade in the United Kingdom. And he's a writer who's quite distinct from that other Lowry who's made a bit of a reputation for himself as an artist not very far away in Salford. So thank you, Mr. Mayor, thank you, Brian, and thank you for everyone else. I'm not going to mention you all by name, and thank you for those of you who have come out in the weather. I'll echo very much what Jill said earlier. It's very much appreciated. That for the family it's a very special day. Thank you very much for making this event and the plaque a reality and not a myth. So thank you.
Okay, that's the end of the formal ceremonies, except to say a few last words of thanks. And that's really, again, thank you very much to Peter Bolton. I thanked him before, but I think it's fantastic that the Wirral Conservation Areas have put this together with us. To Wirral Council again, to Lucy Barrow from the Council, from Eileen Wilshaw, and especially in relation to today, Alison Bailey-Smith and Tony Hope for their help in getting this venue organised, and to Caroline Lang, who's the constituency manager. Thank you to all of those. Thank you to the Blue Coat staff, particularly Louis, for doing a fantastic job, and thank you for the volunteers who've come here today to help out on this. It's fantastic. So, I have a glass here, I hope you do, and I think we should finish the formal ceremonies by toasting Malcolm Lowry on his birthday.
One cannoli. One cannoli.
Do that's it. So do just wander about. There's some books we've got around the corner which Helen and I edited a few years ago, and there's some food and drink next door. And come and have a chat with us feminists. Thank you.